The game of life. Have you ever had your children or grandchildren look at you and say, "I'm bored"? Well, Frederick Buckner said boredom ought to be one of the 7 deadly sins. And often when a little child says that, "I'm bored," it's actually a call for us big people, the adults, not so much to entertain them, but to play with them or engage with them in life. And that's something that we've done for all of our lives with our children and grandchildren. But we didn't do it to stave off this thing called boredom. We did it because it was genuinely fun to do it with them. And playing games teaches all sorts of lessons in life. The first one is that if you play the game, you might lose. And if you never play the game, you definitely will never win. And over the years, we had this sort of unspoken, or sometimes spoken actually, rule that if a child starts the game, they must complete it. In other words, if they start to lose and they start to get a bit upset, they've still got to continue the game. And it's a great lesson for life. We have this very old game called Holiday, and you throw the dice and you go around the board and get certain benefits, or certain things can happen to you. And you might land on a square, especially right near the start, that says you left the stove on or the door unlocked, so you have to go back home. And that's really quite a test for all of us, because the rest are trundling on round the board and you're stuck at home. But the message here really is, we've got to stay in the game. We've got to play the game. We can't recline back into nothingness. Question: what do you think is the most dangerous object in your home? Well, university research amazingly has studied the most dangerous household items. So, for example, 460,000 people in the States a year are injured by kitchen knives. That's understandable. Manual and power saws account for about 100,000 injuries a year, but some risks are surprising. Every year, 20 people in the US are strangled to death by drapery cords, and some 4,000 people seriously injure themselves on pillows. But where it comes to engaging in the game of life and being in the game, the most dangerous object in your home is a back-reclining, deeply cushioned, foot-resting little death trap called an easy chair. They're not called challenge chairs or adventure chairs. They're not actually that beautiful. We buy them for one reason: comfort. And of course, the single most important device someone sitting in this chair needs to hold in his hand is a remote control. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got an easy type chair and my feet can go up, and remote controls are not far from my hand, especially in retirement. But to be honest, life is not about that. It's great to have that as a comfort, but it's not about pursuing comfort and trying to minimize problems and stress and maximize safety and security. You know, we lock the world out and we're comfortable there. That's fine. But life is more than that. And the real danger is swapping out this comfort for the things that you don't do, that you could do. The relationships that need to be deepened, for example. The races that aren't run, the battles that you never fight, the laughs you don't laugh, even the tears you don't weep. You and I were made for something more than life in the chair. And that's why we say it may be the most dangerous object in your house. Scientists in Berkeley did a study years ago. They put an amoeba in an ideal environment. Perfect temperature, perfect humidity, perfect amount of light, food conditions, etc. And that little amoeba had no stress, no problems, no challenges. And do you know what happened to it? It died. Too much comfort can be lethal. Of course, a little bit of comfort can be wonderful. If a person is able to, they can't just sit there, because life is not all about escaping from it. There was a guy called Larry Walker who wanted to fly, but he had poor eyesight, which disqualified him from pilot status in the Air Force. So he got an idea. He hitched up 45 helium-filled weather balloons to his lawn chair, strapped himself in with some sandwiches, a pellet gun, and a six-pack of drink. And his plan was to hover 30 feet or so above the backyard for a few hours, then shoot enough balloons to come down. But he had overdone it. His chair and balloons stopped climbing at 16,000 feet. And at this height, he was reluctant to shoot anything. He drifted with his beer and sandwiches into the airspace of Los Angeles airport. It caused absolute mayhem with flight control and other planes in the area. And so after a few hours of being up there, he decided to risk shooting a few balloons. And eventually he descended enough to get tangled up in some power lines where he was rescued. The FAA spokesman said, "We don't know what part of the Federal Aviation Act he broke, but as soon as we figure it out, a charge will be filed." And as they led Larry away in handcuffs, a reporter asked him why he did it. This is what he said: "A man can't just sit there." His crazy feat merited inclusion in the Darwin Awards, a book about people who, through incredibly stupid acts, elevate the IQ of the human race by eliminating themselves from the gene pool. A man just can't sit there. And while I don't encourage people to do what he did, we must, as people, have challenge and risk and adventure in some way. We've got to stay in the game. It's all about making life an adventuresome partnership with God. The Bible has numerous accounts of God calling ordinary people to do specific assignments. And within these stories, scholars have identified a consistent pattern. So let's walk through some of them together and see what they mean for us. So there is the initial call. So God summons someone to serve him. And you might have noticed that very rarely in the Bible does God bother to interrupt someone's life and ask him or her to do an easy task. He doesn't call Moses over to a burning bush and ask him if he could take on a few more sheep. One entire chapter in the Bible, Hebrews 11, is devoted to a series of encounters where God asks people to embrace high-risk assignments. God asks Noah to build an ark in the face of ridicule, Abraham to leave everything familiar and then to become a father at the age of 99, Joseph to be faithful in the face of slavery and imprisonment, and Moses to defy Pharaoh. The writer in Hebrews gives a whole account of those who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Others were tortured and refused to be released. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put into prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. The world was not worthy of them. Really does seem that God wants to use us, wants to grow us up, wants us to be strong and wise and courageous. He doesn't appear to be terribly interested in making sure we're comfortable. Ortberg notes that he would not make a good flight attendant. And the second thing is our response. In all these call narratives, the person God interrupts gives his or her initial reaction directly to God. And to be honest, if you know anything about what is in the Bible, the people that God called and interrupted their lives didn't jump at the chance. I mean, they didn't say, "What a great opportunity. I'll go and defy Pharaoh. I'll take on the Midianites. I'll spend a night in the lion's den, walk into a fiery furnace, marry a pregnant girl who claims she's still a virgin. Yeah, that's fine. I'll face jeers and flogging and chains and prison. Fabulous. What a great challenge." You see, almost always the response is fear. And this is interesting because sometimes people say things like, "God would never ask me to do something that I'm scared to do," or "God would never ask me to do something that I can't handle." And they misquote often a passage from the Bible from Corinthians where Paul says, "God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear." But Paul's point is that we can never worm out of responsibility for sin by saying it's God's fault. That's what it's about. And when you look at the heroes of the faith, both within the Bible and in our world, and even in recent times, there is always fear because the task seems to be insurmountable. heroes of the faith throughout history are all the time given burdens they cannot handle. And in fact, you could argue that if there isn't any challenge or even fear in front of you, then perhaps there's a good chance that God isn't in that challenge. I would encourage you not to sit on that chair for too long. Another striking aspect of these stories of heroes in the Bible was that even though people almost always have an initial response of resistance, God never reacts by saying, "Oh, I can see where this would be pretty scary. Okay, never mind, I'll get somebody else." God knows that people get scared, so he makes them a promise. God said to Joshua, "Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." He said to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And no one had ever called Gideon a mighty warrior before then. So do these kinds of promises mean nothing bad will happen? To the contrary. But a man, you see, just can't sit there. And here's the promise. The promise is that nothing can separate you from the love of God. You may suffer. You may get hurt or die. Eventually, we're all going to die anyway. Someone once said that Jesus promised those who would follow him only three things: that they would be absurdly happy, entirely fearless, and always in trouble. The problem is that most of us figure that 2 out of 3 ain't too bad. And another thing, feeling inadequate is common to us all. We all are. I am. And that's why God promises to go with us. What matters is your decision. And only people who say yes to challenge, demand, and risk are ever fully alive. Recently, I went to the beach with some of the family, and we went to a part of the beach where there was rocky outcrops and cliffs, and it was very popular on a beautiful day, and there was a whole lineup of young people who, with bravado, were jumping off a very high cliff into deep water down below. There weren't, strangely enough, too many old people around, and there I come, a granddad of around 70 years of age, taking my turn with people staring at me at the top of the pinnacle of this rock. I look way, way down into this deep sea water, and I jump. And we have a saying from that song, anything could happen, and it probably will. I mean, I could have ended up in hospital or whatever, but it was absolutely exhilarating. It was worth the effort, worth the risk. So the question here is, what ledge is God asking you to jump off right now? God makes the call, we make the move. And it's amazing what can happen when we say yes to God. The world changes a little bit. If you recall in Scripture, the authorities who had imprisoned Peter and John for teaching about Jesus, and they tried everything they could do to intimidate them, but they would not stop talking about God and about Jesus. And we're told that when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. When you say yes to God, then lives get changed, including your own. Yes, God makes the call. We make the move, and we begin the adventure. This is what happened in my life. Over 40 years ago, there was a call to go into full-time ministry, and I'm so glad, even with the doubts and the fears and the uncertainties and inadequacies, I'm so glad that I responded to God, because life as I knew it changed forever. And guess what? There were no guarantees up front. I had to live by this thing called faith. And that is not walking by sight, but walking by faith. I'm reminded of a story from the life of John Paton, a Scottish missionary who had travelled to the New Hebrides, a group of islands in the southwest Pacific. And he was determined to tell the tribal people about Jesus, but it was very dangerous. He struggled to find the right word for faith. One day his indigenous servant came in. Paton raised both feet off the floor and sat back in his chair and asked, "What am I doing now?" In reply, the servant used a word that means to lean your whole weight upon. And this became the expression that Paton used. Faith is leaning your whole weight upon Jesus. You see, a man can't just sit there. God bless you.